Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're heading back to the Delhi Sultanate.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, this was a pretty significant chunk of Indian history, like from 1206 to 1526 CE.
Hmm.
And get this, we're not just talking about kings and battles, although there are definitely plenty of those.
Right, of course.
But we're going to look at how the economic policies of this era actually impacted everyday life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find so fascinating about this period.
Totally. And to do this deep dive, right, we've gone beyond the usual stuff,
Hmm.
the textbooks and all that.
Oh, so what have we got?
We've got architectural studies, we've
Interesting.
got inscriptions, and we've even got travelers' tales from back in the day.
Wow, that's a really cool mix of sources.
Right. It gives us this, like, multi-dimensional view, which I love.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, right? You get these glimpses from different angles, and suddenly, boom, the picture becomes so much clearer. Exactly. And it's not just about the big picture either. It's about understanding how these policies, these decisions made at the top, actually played out in people's lives.
So for those of us who maybe slept through that part of history class,
Hmm.
can we get a little refresher on what the Delhi Sultanate actually was?
You bet. Okay, so first of all, it's important to note that the Delhi Sultanate wasn't like this single unified empire.
Oh, okay, so not just one big emperor calling all the shots.
Not quite. Think of it more like different dynasties, different rulers, all kind of vying for power over a few centuries.
Got it. So like a constantly shifting power dynamic.
Exactly. But what ties them all together is this base in Delhi, and even more importantly, they all had a pretty significant influence over a big chunk of the Indian subcontinent.
Makes sense. So what makes them stand out from an economic perspective?
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting. The Delhi Sultanate implemented these unique economic policies that had a direct impact on, well, everything, like their social structure.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about real social change driven by economic forces.
Absolutely. Their culture, even the architecture of the time, all of it was shaped by how they handled trade, taxes, even how they spent their wealth.
I'm already hooked.
Okay,
Okay,
go.
so let's dive into some specifics. In our prep materials, we saw a lot about trade monopolies. The Sultanate had a pretty tight grip on certain goods, right?
Oh, yeah, they were major players in trade.
It's like imagining those ancient spice routes, but with the Sultanate calling the shots on what goes where and for how much.
That's a great way to put it. They weren't just participating in trade, they were controlling it.
Whoa, so it was like they were the gatekeepers of the spice trade?
In a way, yes. We're talking about commodities like spices. Those were incredibly valuable back then. They were flowing all the way to the Mediterranean and beyond.
I can only imagine how much money that generated.
Oh, tons. It brought in a massive amount of wealth.
But it also must have had a huge impact on the people involved, right?
Mhm.
Not just the rulers, but the merchants, the everyday folks.
Absolutely. When you control something as essential as trade, you're not just influencing the economy, you're influencing who has power, how wealth is distributed.
And probably even what people eat and wear.
Right. You got it. It ripples out in all sorts of ways. It really shaped the entire social fabric of the time.
Okay, so paint us a picture. How did these monopolies actually work? Did they have, like, their own ships sailing all over the place? Were there massive warehouses piled high with spices?
It's fun to imagine those scenes, isn't it? But in reality, it was more about,
More like a behind-the-scenes kind of control.
exactly. Think regulations, agreements, that sort of thing. The Sultanate would grant licenses.
Okay, so like permits to trade certain goods.
Yes, exactly. To specific merchants or guilds. It was their way of controlling who got to be a part of this super lucrative trade network.
Ah, so if you wanted to get in on the spice game, you had to play by the Sultanate's rules.
Pretty much, they'd set prices.
So no haggling with the Sultanate, I guess.
Right. They'd control production in some cases, well, where they could, and they'd impose taxes on these trades.
Of course. Got to get their cut.
Right. They were making sure a big chunk of those profits flowed right back to them.
Smart move, I guess, if you're the Sultanate. But also kind of ruthless, right?
Yeah.
Shutting out competitors, favoring certain groups.
Well, yeah. That's power for you. They had the ability to shape the entire economic landscape, and they definitely used it.
I wonder if any of that wealth funded those incredible buildings the Sultanate was known for. Those mosques and palaces are stunning.
Oh, absolutely. You can't separate the economic policies from the architecture. They're completely intertwined.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Those intricate designs and massive structures that all take serious cash.
Yeah, someone had to pay for it all. And it's very likely a good chunk of that funding came directly from the Sultanate's control of trade.
So these economic policies literally shaped the physical landscape. That's pretty amazing to think about.
It really is. Take the Quwat al-Islam Mosque in Delhi, for example. It's one of the earliest examples of what we call Indo-Islamic architecture.
Like a blend of styles.
Exactly. You see elements from both cultures coming together, but its scale, the sheer size of the thing, the incredibly detailed carvings,
All that takes money.
big time. And that money, well, it probably came from those trade monopolies.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we've covered trade, and we've seen how it shaped the architecture. What about taxes? I'm always curious how empires back then managed to pay for, well, everything.
Oh, taxes were definitely a cornerstone of the Sultanate's economic system. They couldn't have functioned without them.
I bet. So what kind of taxes are we talking about?
Well, they had a whole system. There were land taxes, of course, levied on agricultural production,
So, like, the farmers had to pay a portion of their crops or something.
something like that. And then there were trade taxes.
Ah, makes sense. Anything passing through their territory got taxed.
Yep. And then there was the jizya, a tax specifically for non-Muslim subjects.
The jizya. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic.
Yeah, definitely.
We're not trying to endorse anything here, but it's important to understand how it worked back then, just to get a clearer picture of the economic system.
Right, for sure. So essentially it was a poll tax.
Like a per-person tax.
Exactly, levied on adult non-Muslim men. The idea was that they were considered protected subjects.
Protected.
Yeah, like under the Sultanate's rule, but not required to serve in the military.
Interesting. So the jizya was like a payment for that protection.
You could see it that way. But of course, it also served as this,
As a way of distinguishing between Muslims and non-Muslims.
right. You can't ignore the religious and social implications. It definitely reinforced the dominance of the ruling Muslim elite.
It's a complex issue, that's for sure. And it probably had consequences that went beyond just filling the Sultanate's treasury, right?
Absolutely. But that's a conversation for another time, maybe.
For sure. But now we've got trade, we've got taxes. Those are two
Mhm.
massive parts of any economy. But what I'm really curious about is how all these policies impacted everyday life.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. I mean, we can try to imagine it, right?
Oh, yeah, let's do that.
Picture a bustling marketplace filled with merchants shouting, haggling over prices.
Camels loaded with goods arriving from far-off lands.
The air thick with the scent of exotic spices.
And all these artisans, their workshops humming with activity, creating those incredible buildings we talked about.
Yeah, like a whole society buzzing with economic energy.
It's amazing to think that those grand policies we talked about, they weren't just abstract ideas, they were actually shaping lives.
They were creating winners and losers. They were influencing everything from the buildings to the social fabric of the Sultanate.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here, but it's already so compelling. It makes you want to keep digging deeper to see how it all played out.
Right. We've got the Sultanate's policies, but what did it all mean for the people living through it? Did they thrive, or did it just make a few people really, really rich?
Those are the big questions.
Yeah.
And to answer them, we have to really think about all the complexities and nuances of that time.
Exactly. It's not just about dates and names. It's about understanding a whole society, a whole way of life.
And that's what we're here to do. So when we come back, we'll dig even deeper into those social consequences. We'll see how those economic policies created opportunities, how they created inequalities, and ultimately how they left their mark on the Delhi Sultanate.
Wait, before we go, there's one more thing I just have to mention. It's about Mariam al-Zamani.
Mariam al-Zamani. Oh, I've heard whispers about her. This is going to be good.
So Mariam al-Zamani, she was the queen mother. And get this, the sources show she was a seriously savvy investor, especially when it came to trade.
Whoa, hold on. A queen mother involved in trade. That's not exactly the image that pops into my head when I think about royalty back then.
Right, it really challenges our assumptions. But it's true. She used her position and her wealth to actively engage with the whole economic system.
So we're not just talking about some royal figurehead here.
Nope. This was a woman who knew how to make things happen, how to make her money work for her.
I love that. It just goes to show you, women weren't just sitting on the sidelines in the Delhi Sultanate.
Exactly. They were shaping the economic landscape.
It makes you wonder how many other stories like hers are out there just waiting to be discovered.
Oh, I bet there are tons. It really highlights how those traditional historical narratives, you know, the ones that focus mostly on the men.
They only tell part of the story.
Exactly. But okay, let's zoom back out for a sec. We've talked about the Sultanate's policies, but we still need to figure out how they actually impacted everyday life.
Right, because it's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, the kings, the battles, all that. But what did it actually mean for the people living through it? Did they have a chance to thrive, or did these policies just end up making a select few incredibly wealthy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to get even close to an answer, we got to really dig into all the complexities, all the nuances of that time.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, let's go back to those trade monopolies. We know they brought in a ton of wealth, but the real question is, how did that wealth, or did it even, trickle down to the rest of society?
Okay, I'm picturing that bustling marketplace. Again, merchants haggling, caravans coming in, the smells, the sounds. But something tells me not all merchants were created equal back then, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Some of them probably hit the jackpot thanks to those monopolies. I mean, if you were lucky enough to be on the Sultanate's good side, you could make a killing. But for others,
For others, it was probably a struggle just to stay afloat.
you got it. Imagine you're a merchant who's been trading a certain product for generations. Maybe your family's been doing it for centuries, and then, bam, the Sultanate comes along and slaps a monopoly on that very thing.
That's got to be devastating. What do you even do at that point?
Well, you've got a couple of options, neither of them great. You can try to play by the Sultanate's rules, which means getting a license, paying fees, hoping you don't get squeezed out by the competition, or you find a new line of work, start all over. And who knows if you'll be as successful or if you'll even survive.
It's like they were forced to gamble with their livelihoods.
It was a high-stakes game, that's for sure. And the Sultanate held all the cards.
So those who were adaptable, who could play the game and maybe even become like agents for the Sultanate, they probably did pretty well.
Oh, yeah. They were the winners. But those who couldn't adapt or who were deliberately excluded,
They got left behind.
I'm afraid so. It makes you wonder if there was any pushback, any resistance to all of this.
Oh, I bet there was. People don't just sit back and watch their livelihoods get destroyed without a fight.
Right. You'd think there'd be protests, maybe even riots, people trying to protect what they've built.
Makes sense. But then again, those monopolies probably brought a certain level of stability too, right?
That's true. I mean, for some merchants, having the Sultanate regulate prices, control the flow of goods.
It took some of the risk out of it.
Exactly. It meant they could predict, to some extent, what they'd be earning. They wouldn't have to worry so much about sudden price drops or gluts in the market.
So like a trade-off. Stability in exchange for less freedom.
You could see it that way. And like with most things, there were winners and losers, and trying to figure out how all these policies played out for different groups.
It's like solving a giant historical puzzle.
Exactly. And it's not just about the economics of it all either. We have to remember, economics and social status, they're always intertwined.
Right, because your economic standing often determines your place in society.
And vice versa. So it makes you wonder, did these economic policies actually help people climb the social ladder, or did they just reinforce those existing hierarchies? Like, let's take the artisans, for example.
The artisans, the folks who created those amazing mosques, the palaces, those incredible gardens, they must have been in high demand with all that royal patronage going on.
Oh, yeah. The Sultanate needed skilled craftspeople, stone carvers, calligraphers, tile makers, the list goes on. And with that demand, you'd think there'd be some opportunity for social advancement, right?
I mean, if you're the one creating those masterpieces, the ones everyone's talking about,
You'd think you'd gain some recognition, some prestige, maybe even some social mobility. I mean, imagine being the Sultanate's go-to architect.
or the master calligrapher, the one whose work is on display in every mosque.
Exactly. Those were the rock stars of their day. And you can imagine them earning higher wages, getting those plum commissions, maybe even becoming friends with powerful people.
So, like, they could actually rise above their original social standing.
It's possible. But we can't forget the Delhi Sultanate was a society with deep-rooted social structures. There were hierarchies based on birth, caste, religion, and those didn't just disappear overnight.
So even the most talented artisan, they might hit a ceiling, a limit to how far they could climb.
It's likely. It's a classic case of it's complicated. And speaking of complicated, what about the farmers? They were the ones literally feeding everyone in the Sultanate. How did these policies impact them?
Right. They had to deal with land taxes, but they were also essential for producing all those goods being traded, right?
Absolutely. Their lives were directly tied to those economic policies. And when it comes to land taxes, we have to ask some tough questions. How were those taxes collected? Were they fair? Did they cripple the farmers, or were they manageable?
Yeah, were there any systems in place to protect the farmers, or were they just at the mercy of whoever was in charge of collecting those taxes?
It makes you wonder, right? It's one thing to look at the numbers, but what about the human stories behind those numbers?
It's a side of history that often gets overlooked, but it's so important to understanding the real impact of these policies.
And then there's the flip side of the coin, the Sultanate's focus on trade monopolies. That created a huge demand for agricultural goods, right?
So on one hand, it's good for the farmers. They can sell more, maybe even make more money,
Right. But it can also lead to some pretty negative consequences. Over-cultivation of the land.
which can damage the soil, make it less fertile.
Exactly. And then you've got resource depletion, maybe even farmers getting pushed off their land because someone decides it's more profitable to grow something else.
So it's this double-edged sword. Economic growth on one side, potential hardship on the other.
It all ties back to this idea of social impact, right? It's not just a buzzword. It's about those ripple effects, those consequences that you don't always see right away.
Yeah, like the unintended consequences of those policies.
Yeah.
It's not just about numbers. It's about real lives being touched, changed, sometimes even ruined.
Exactly. And it reminds us that economic history, it's not just about policies and profits. It's about people. It's about their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. We can't forget that.
We've talked about trade, taxes, the impact on different groups, but there's another layer here, right? What about cultural exchange?
Ah, yes. The Delhi Sultanate, remember, it wasn't this isolated bubble. They were connected to this vast network of trade routes that spanned continents.
So people weren't just trading goods, they were trading ideas.
Exactly. Ideas, beliefs, practices, and that kind of exchange can have a huge impact on society. It's like adding a new spice to your favorite dish.
I like that. It can make it better, more flavorful.
Right. But it can also completely change the dish, maybe not in a good way.
So in the Delhi Sultanate, did they embrace these new influences or was there pushback?
Well, the sources show us both sides of the coin. On one hand, you can see a real blending of cultures, especially in the architecture.
Like that Quwwat al-Islam mosque we talked about earlier, that blend of Islamic and Hindu elements.
Exactly. That mosque really symbolizes that exchange. It shows us that the Sultanate was open to incorporating elements of the local culture, maybe as a way of solidifying their rule, maybe as a way of appealing to more people.
But we also talked about the jizya, that tax on non-Muslims. That doesn't exactly scream cultural harmony, does it?
You're right. That's the other side of the coin. Cultural exchange wasn't always easy or peaceful. It could lead to tension, division, especially when religion was involved, and that tension could have real social and economic consequences.
Because if people aren't getting along, they're probably not doing business together.
Right. It could lead to mistrust, resentment, even violence. So you see this balancing act happening throughout the Delhi Sultanate.
Trying to embrace new ideas while holding onto old traditions, trying to create opportunities while also dealing with existing inequalities. It's fascinating, and it makes me think there's no easy answer to the question of whether their economic policies were ultimately good or bad.
That's the beauty of studying history, isn't it? There are rarely easy answers. Instead, it makes us wrestle with complexity, consider different viewpoints, really appreciate all those nuances.
And that's what makes it so interesting. It's not about memorizing facts and dates. It's about engaging with the past, trying to understand it on a deeper level.
Exactly. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the Delhi Sultanate, I want to leave you, our listeners, with a question to ponder.
Okay, so we're back, and I feel like my brain is bursting with all these details about the Delhi Sultanate.
I know, right? It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's so fascinating, too. We've gone from these grand economic policies to the lives of everyday people, and it all connects back to that question you asked earlier.
Ah, yes, the big one.
Were the economic policies of the Delhi Sultanate ultimately a force for progress, or did they just create more inequality?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because it seems like they did both, in a way.
Yeah, that's what we've been grappling with this whole time.
Exactly. I mean, on one hand, you can't deny that the Sultanate's control of trade, especially those monopolies, brought in a huge amount of wealth.
And that wealth allowed them to do some pretty impressive things.
Oh, absolutely. They invested in infrastructure, they supported the arts, they created this whole economic system that connected them to the rest of the world.
Like those sarais we talked about, those roadside inns. They wouldn't have existed without that focus on trade.
Right. And think about all the people who benefited from that. The merchants, the artisans, the people transporting goods. It created a whole web of economic activity.
But then, like we've discussed, there's that other side of the coin. Those same policies could also lead to some pretty serious inequalities.
Yeah, that's the downside. Monopolies might be profitable, but they can also stifle competition.
Which means fewer opportunities for people who aren't already part of that inner circle.
Exactly. And then there are the taxes. Sure, every empire needs taxes to function, but they can be levied unfairly, they can burden certain groups more than others.
And then, of course, there's the jizya, that tax on non-Muslims.
Yeah, it definitely created a social and religious divide.
It's like we're trying to weigh these two sides on a scale, and they both have some pretty heavy arguments.
On one side, you've got economic growth, architectural wonders, this flourishing of trade and culture.
And on the other, you've got the potential for exploitation, for social division, for barriers to opportunity.
It makes it really hard to say definitively whether the overall impact was positive or negative.
And maybe that's the point, that history isn't always black and white.
Exactly. The Delhi Sultanate was this period of incredible innovation and change, but it also carried with it all these pre-existing social hierarchies and inequalities.
So to understand it, we have to hold both of those truths in our minds at the same time.
That's what makes studying history so challenging, but also so rewarding. It forces us to confront these complexities.
It's like we're starting to see the Delhi Sultanate not just as a name in a textbook, but as this living, breathing society full of contradiction.
Yes, with real people, making real choices, dealing with real consequences.
And for me, that's the real magic of these deep dives. We're not just learning about the past, we're actually engaging with it, wrestling with its complexities.
And hopefully our listeners are doing the same, asking their own questions, digging a little deeper, maybe even questioning some of the things they thought they knew.
And who knows, maybe someone out there will be inspired to uncover some of those hidden stories, like the one about Mariam al-Zamani, the Queen Mother who was such a savvy investor.
Imagine all the details waiting to be discovered about her life, her decisions, her impact.
It's like a whole other deep dive just waiting to happen.
And that's just one story. There are countless others buried in the history of the Delhi Sultanate, waiting for someone to bring them to light.
So, to everyone listening, we say, keep those history books open. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into this amazing world of history.
Because the Delhi Sultanate may be long gone, but its legacy, its lessons, its mysteries, they're still very much alive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.